Greetings and welcome back to 303. And this morning we are going to spend a few minutes now introducing ourselves to the epic, Anglo-Saxon epic poem, Beowulf. I'm with you on page 36 and 37 of our hymnal. Here we are going to be looking at the introduction to Beowulf, some themes across centuries, and the translator's insights. That is to say, Burton Raffles' introduction to Beowulf. He is the translator that we will be reading in our study, partial reading parts of the epic poem Beowulf. We in our anthology don't read all of it. Let's go ahead, however, and notice right away in our note-taking at level 1, all we're doing here is bullet pointing. Let's point out for ourselves that you have some headings. I would recommend that maybe you write down these headings as we go through the bullet point, and then all we'll do is try to reduce each bit of information under each heading to one line, okay? Or maybe 2 lines, all right? So let's go ahead and pause for a moment. You can see the picture, of course, of Burton Raffles there on page 36. Let's go ahead now and read A Legendary Tale Larger Than Life. Beowulf is a sweeping, action-packed narrative written in highly dramatic language. Its characters are almost all kings, princes, and their heroic followers. The plot is engaged by a pair of powerful man-eating monsters and at the end a greedy fire-spouting dragon. All 3 are killed by the poem's principal character, Beowulf. Spoiler alert, sorry about that. Who possesses magical qualities of his own. He can swim for days on end. He can breathe for extended periods underwater. His very name tells us in 3 ways that he is no mere human. He is Beo, or bear. He is also wolf, or wolf. And most important of all, his name does not begin exactly as his father's name, Ecgtheow. For everyone in Anglo-Saxon England, this break in tradition would have been a dead giveaway of Beowulf's extraordinary character. So, let's just pause for a moment and point out the very name of this cat gives us insight into the fact that he is a very special superhero. Notice he will derive his names from two animals, right? The bear and the wolf, which will tell us something about how strong he is, how courageous he is, how much he loves to fight. A grand beginning. Let's keep going. The story crackles with wonderfully calculated suspense. The hero himself is not introduced at the start. Man-eating Grendel takes the stage, emerging out of the kind of darkness and terror in which Anglo-Saxon life was steeped. Beowulf comes to help the besieged King Hrothgar. His exciting travel over the deep waters was the first part of the poem I read over 50 years ago, Burton Raffles will tell us. The poem carefully explains his heroic, profoundly social motives, offering himself as a potential sacrifice to Grendel. He fights with and tears an arm off the monster, who flees back into darkness. Everyone is overjoyed. There is much celebrating until Grendel's mother enters the scene, hungry, literally for revenge. Beowulf promptly accepts the challenge, diving far down into the water, finding the lady demon, and in the end killing her in a very close fight. Loaded with praise and gifts, he returns to his own king, to whose throne he succeeds. Let's pause for a moment then and write this down. Beowulf then is going to be an epic poem of monsters and the fighting of monsters. We will have the first monster, Grendel. We will have the second monster, Grendel's mother. And then finally the third monster will be a dragon. We should also point out the social motives. We will ask this question: what motivates Beowulf to come to the land of the Danes and do what he does? One answer provided here, let's write it down, is a feeling of social needs. Okay? This is what we will later call duty. And the idea here that we will want to point out is that Beowulf is willing to kind of sacrifice himself for the greater good. A very Anglo-Saxon idea. We will ask later in our conversations if it's possible that this idea of sacrifice for the greater good is one that has now become somewhat lost in our postmodern culture, as it's often called. Let's return, page 36, the passage of time. 50 years later, the old Beowulf's land is terrorized by a fire-breathing dragon. Unlike a good king, and like some of the bad kings in the poem, the dragon fiercely guards and never shares its treasures. Beowulf does not hesitate, but he is old and not as strong as he was. Significantly, he must have help and is so badly burned that the dragon, after the dragon is dead, Beowulf too dies. His people give him a royal burial and a monument and sing the praises due to a fearless ruler who so totally embodied the virtues of a warrior king. So let's just point out for a moment here, serious spoiler alert, this epic poem will end with the death of Beowulf. Okay? A dragon will kill him. But in the process, Beowulf, along with the help of a great warrior Wiglaf, will actually defeat the dragon. Okay? I'm on page 37. The spirit of Beowulf. Beowulf is not a pagan poem. There are no pagan gods, no idols, no wanton human sacrifices. Anglo-Saxon England had long since been Christianized when Beowulf was composed, but the epic is primarily concerned with social, not religious issues. Still, if not overtly Christian, Beowulf's close identification with ancient Hebraic ways of life marks it as very much an Old Testament poem. Almighty God, clearly and repeatedly invoked, operates ethically and holds humans to high moral standards. The creation story of Genesis is beautifully paraphrased. Hell is cited as the home of evil. The Abel and Cain tale is mentioned explicitly. And just as evil is punished, good prevails. The message is that men must learn to behave responsibly and to love and be faithful to one another, exactly as Beowulf has shown that they can. Now, let's pause for a moment and just point out the Beowulf epic then is going to have a very Christian element. Let's write it in our notes. We roughly will qualify the writing of the Beowulf epic. It is an oral story long before it is written down. But the writing of the Beowulf epic sometime between 750 and 1000 Common Era, after the death of Christ, okay? Go ahead and turn the page. This is the preparing to read page. I just want to make a comment for those of us who are just now beginning our study in Senior English and our Senior English Anthology. Before almost every text, there will be this before you read page, which will involve usually 2 pages. You can see this on page 38, 39. Let's take some real quick notes on what it is you're looking at when you're looking at these 2 pages. Highly significant for exam prep, because so much of the information that's presented here will be emphasized later in our study and reading. That, by the way, is what we often will refer to as objectives. First of all, there will always be some kind of an essential question that will be introduced, like on page 38. We will then be introduced to literary analysis. Make a note to yourself, this is our reading level 2B, the rhetorical level. Not what the poet or the author says, but how the poet or author says it. We will always have an emphasis then, something we will be looking at in our literary analysis of 2B. There will usually be some kind of suggested reading strategy, and finally there will usually be some vocabulary words. These vocabulary words we're always going to want to write down in our annotations. Why? Because 2 reasons. 1, knowing the vocabulary can help us as readers. 2, we're going to see a number of these vocab words on our exams at the end of our readings. The second part then of our preparing to read is always going to tell us something about the author and something about the relationship between the author and the text over on page 39. Let's look through this material now rather quickly, and let's again be working at level 1 bullet pointing. So I'm with you now on page 38 and page 39. We're simply working now with some basic kinds of bullet pointing. I'm going to start on 38. Connecting to the essential question. In Beowulf, a brave hero battles swamp-dwelling monsters that threaten a kingdom. As you read, notice descriptions of the monsters in Beowulf and consider what the details suggest about Anglo-Saxon ideas about evil. Doing so will help as you explore the essential question, how does literature shape or reflect society? I just want to pause for a moment and have you write down that often readers have pointed out that the 3 monsters of this poem represent 3 different kinds of evil. Okay. Let's jot down just real quickly what we mean by this. The first kind of evil will be represented by Grendel, a very direct evil. An evil that, for example, is coming right at you and you can easily see it coming. We often think of physical violence in this way. Okay. Grendel comes to Beowulf to fight against Beowulf. The second monster is Grendel's mother, representing a far different kind of evil. This is a monster that is going to be more subtle, more crafty, more deceitful. This is the kind of evil that we might say is more difficult to see. Oftentimes, for your notes, write down the quintessential example of this type of evil is pride. Pride. The third kind of evil will be represented by our third monster, the dragon. And this will be the penultimate evil. The evil from which one cannot ever escape, namely death. The third monster, the dragon, will represent death. And as we get into our study and we meet this third monster, the dragon, we'll see it represented easily as the monster that you have to fight, but you know you cannot defeat. In the end, you will lose. Let's move now to page 38's literary analysis. You might want to be considering as you get started then with your work for Beowulf and the annotative work at level 2B, your focus will be here. An epic. You want to write that word down. Anytime you see one of these letters or these words in bold, you obviously want to give some attention to it, right? An epic is a long narrative poem, sometimes developed orally, that celebrates heroic deeds and legendary events. Epics like Homer's Iliad from ancient Greece are among the earliest forms of literature. As such, they reveal the values of the peoples who created them. For example, in Beowulf, the action in the mead hall reveals the social and economic relationship between an Anglo-Saxon lord and his followers. This is where the lord provides food, shelter, and fellowship in return for loyalty. It's the center of civilization, and all that threatens it is evil. There are several common features of epics, including the following. A song told in a serious manner with elevated language. A hero battling forces that threaten the world's order. Most epics celebrate the exploits of a legendary or epic hero. Again, in bold, so you want to write this down. A larger-than-life character, Beowulf's boastful self-confidence, his feats of strength, his victories in battle make him a classic epic hero because he upholds the values of his culture, loyalty, bravery, honor. He can teach modern readers a great deal about the Anglo-Saxon view of the world. Now, we have a term for this. Let's put it in our notes. We call it a country's national anthem. An anthem just simply means song. And in the very earliest examples of this, national anthems are poems, these long poems that will tell about what a culture most identifies with, what is most important. There are 3 words listed there I hope you've written down. If you want to know about what Anglo-Saxons thought were important, there they are. Loyalty, bravery, and honor. Loyalty, bravery, and honor. And these will comprise what we will call the Anglo-Saxon code. So, as we begin our reading and study of the Beowulf epic, we're going to want to point out when these kinds of things happen in the poem. Okay? We should also point out as well that the Beowulf epic is going to be very heavy on the distinction between the sociological and the psychological. That is to say, between the individual and the group. Psychology, the individual mind. Sociology, the collection, the group. And the Anglo-Saxons are going to argue that the individual is important as part of the group, not external to the group, as part of the group. And therefore, we will meet a word, a very important word in the Anglo-Saxon code, duty, D-U-T-Y, which is somewhat synonymous with the word honor. That is to say, you have a duty as the individual to help take care of the group. All right? In regards to vocabulary, you can see several of the words there, 6 there. I definitely recommend that you write those words down, and you be looking for those words as we enter then into our Beowulf reading itself. I'm now with you on page 39. Let's take some brief notes about the Beowulf epic itself, all right? During Britain's Anglo-Saxon period, from the 5th to the 11th century, few people were able to read, and movies lay centuries in the future. Although the action takes place in 6th century Scandinavia, Beowulf was originally told in, we want to write this phrase down, Old English, the language spoken by the Anglo-Saxons of England during the years 500 to 1100. So let's pause for a moment and let's just make a quick linguistic observation. Old English, the language spoken from 500 to 1100. Okay. I'm continuing now. Beowulf, a Geat from a region that is today southern Sweden, set sail to aid the Danish king Hrothgar in his fight against the monster Grendel, a terrifying swampland creature whose eyes burn with gruesome light. Grendel has been terrorizing Hrothgar's great banquet hall, Heorot, for 12 years. The battle between Beowulf, a young warrior of great strength and courage, and Grendel, his bloodthirsty foe, is the first of the 3 mortal battles that are fought in this long poem. Again, just to pause, you're not going to be reading all of the poem Beowulf. It's a long poem. You're only going to be rereading certain parts of the poem. Forging an epic. I'm on page 39 under the topic Forging an Epic. The tales in Beowulf originate from a time when stories and poems were passed along by word of mouth. Let's write it down. This is what we call the oral tradition. The oral tradition. In other words, stories are told long before they're ever written. In Anglo-Saxon England, traveling minstrels called scops. Let's write this word down. This is our early word for poet. S-C-O-P-S. Captivated audiences with long narrative poems. These poems changed and grew as they were passed from one scop to another. Beowulf was told and retold in this fashion throughout England for hundreds of years. In the 11th century, the epic was finally written down. Okay, in the 11th century, so roughly 1000. Okay, 1000. Now you will find some scholars that will say as early as 750 this poem started to be written down, but probably the more conservative date is 1000, the Common Era. Beowulf, I'm reading again, grew out of other earlier traditions. The monsters and dragons of the tale, the brave warriors steadfastly loyal to their heroic chief, the descendant into the eerie regions below the earth, these were familiar elements of Scandinavian or Celtic folk tales. Even a detail as specific as Beowulf's seizure of Grendel's arm can be traced to earlier tales. In other words, let's just pause for a moment and point out that these stories that we're reading have very ancient roots. Oral stories that will be told over and over again, and all kind of redacted or brought together in stories, epic poems like Beowulf. A guide to life. I'm reading again on page 39. By forging these various traditions into one unified tale, and by adding the later influence of Christianity, the Anglo-Saxon Scots created a central reference point for their culture. Listening to Beowulf, an Anglo-Saxon could learn of bravery and loyalty to one's fellows, of the monsters that spite and hatred could breed, and of the heroism needed to conquer such monsters. Beowulf and popular culture. Let's bullet point 3 here. Nobel Prize winner Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf won the Whitebread Book of the Year Award for Poetry in 1999. And you can see page 68-69 for some comments on his translation. Roger Avery and Neil Gaiman adapted Beowulf as a computer-animated movie in 2007 with voiceovers performed by such stars as Angelina Jolie, Anthony Hopkins, John Malkovich. For those of you who have not seen this film, I recommend it to you. This is a 2007 film. You can YouTube this one and watch it. A Beowulf comic book series was issued in connection with the Beowulf movie as well, and you can always Google and try and find that one as well. You'll have a few bits of information about this one later in your textbook. I'll look here just to make sure that you know what pages we're talking about. If you go to it over on page 77, 78, 79, you'll see some comics that have been drawn. Okay. All right, so enough of an introduction. Let's now turn to the actual study of the text itself, the epic poem Beowulf. Thank you.